let's keep this simple. In Old Oyo, a few clues raise a quiet question about men and intimacy at court. Some elders' stories remember the Alafin king keeping certain male attendants very close. Court praise poems sometimes describe bonds between men in warm personal language. Palace records list eerie shaved-head pages and officials who stayed near the ruler day and night. Missionaries and travelers also wrote about unnatural friendships, but they judged through foreign morals. Proverbs and a few Ifa verses hint at friendships that didn't fit neat boxes. What do these bits mean? Real same-sex intimacy? Just political favor described in poetic words? Or outsiders misreading court life? We can't say for sure. The trail is thin. Tell me in the comments and add the exact time you're watching. If you like clear, no-nonsense history, told with open questions, you can subscribe. Totally up to you. The palace keeps secrets better than people do. You feel it the moment you step under the carved lintel air cooler, then outside light pooled like calm water across packed earth voices, falling to a hush as if sound itself has learned etiquette. This is the Alafin's compound, a city within a city, and you move through it like someone reading the margins of a long manuscript. Corridors don't just connect rooms, they braid power. Courtyards don't just hold ceremonies, they teach people where to stand, how long to wait, and when to notice nothing at all. Drums wake the morning before the sun quite does. Each pattern is an announcement, a tiny constitution written in rhythm. You hear the talking drum imitate names, echo proverbs, and pass along news without ever saying news. The Alaafin's body is a symbol here. When he sneezes, someone weighs the omen. When he laughs, attendants recalibrate their posture to match his mood. In that climate, a glance lasts longer than language, and you learn to measure the temperature of the room by how quickly a hand is withdrawn. You notice the Alari first, because you are supposed to notice them last. They move in pairs, foreheads, shaven steps, neat eyes trained to slide past what most people would stare at. Their job is thresholds. Who passes, who waits, who never learns there was a door. They carry words that shouldn't be written down and stand beside chambers where proximity can be policy. If you've ever watched how junior staff orbit a CEO at a conference badges, flashing notebooks clutched, you recognize the choreography scaled up to the size of a kingdom. What would you do if your task was to see everything and be seen as nothing? The Alari, perfect that art. They know whose sandals scuff when he's anxious, which counselor slows his speech when asked a risky question, which page lingers an extra heartbeat before answering the king. Human bonds don't stop at the edge of duty, they blur. A defense offered too quickly at council becomes a rumor before sunset. A summons at an unusual hour acquires ceremonial language that makes it unassailable, even if everyone understands the subtext they must not name. The architecture conspires with the people. Earthen walls hold coolness and confidences. Low archways nudge shoulders closer than formality prefers. At night, torches hiss, and attendants sleep side by side along veranda. Edges the way travelers on a crowded train negotiate space with breath and sleeves. Privacy is rare, so familiarity grows thick. And once familiarity roots, warmth becomes easy to misread or to weaponize depending on who benefits. You listen to soft quarrels about door assignments as if they were court cases, which in their own way they are. Historians who caught fragments of this world wrote with careful hands. Samuel Johnson, the 19th century Yoruba clergyman, not the English wit gathered palace traditions and sometimes left sentences unfinished where the subject turned delicate. His ellipses feel like a raised eyebrow. Oral historians do the same in performance, a pause, a chuckle, a wave that says, "You understand," and lets the audience supply the details. Do you find yourself supplying them now? Markets overhear palaces. A drummer tries a new phrase, and by dusk, the market women already have a nickname for the counselor who reacted too sharply. You pass the outer courtyards and catch the hum of commerce folding court stories into jokes the way office canteens today remix boardroom drama into memes. Humor is safer than accusation. Innuendo moves faster than proclamations. If you wanted to know who stands closest to the Alafin this week, you would buy pepper and listen. Inside the compound, Allegiance wears many uniforms. Some attendants are stern, some indulgent, and the difference can tilt the day. You see a senior steward guide a junior through protocol, voice low gestures, exact a hand resting just a moment longer than instruction requires. Is that mentorship, affection, or both? You don't ask aloud. You notice how another Ilari watches the pair expression practiced into neutrality. People learn early to let their faces be rooms with closed shutters. Ritual lets everything breathe without naming it. An unexpected summons becomes a rite. A gift exchanged at dusk receives a proverb to explain its timing. In a society trained to hear meaning in cadence, the safest place to shelter a feeling is under a drumbeat. You sense how loyalty, tenderness, and ambition braid into a single rope, hard to separate without fraying the whole. Sometimes you wonder whether anyone in the palace ever sleeps fully. The night has a way of filing things for morning review. Colonial visitors later walked these same halls and wrote brisk reports about taxes, horses, and roads. Their notebooks rarely paused for the social weather inside the walls. Perhaps they didn't know how to translate it. Perhaps they chose not to. Papers prefer columns and totals. Warmth resists columns and totals. What does a ledger do with a lingering look? You suspect the clearest archive here is the body language people practiced for years. How a shoulder angles, how a voice thins, how laughter stops mid-breath when the wrong person enters. The palace keeps its own time. A day can stretch when you wait in shade for a sentence that will decide your standing, and it can vanish when the Alafin smiles your way and everyone pretends not to notice. So you keep your step measured, your voice steady the way a drummer keeps a hand poised over skin between strokes. Somewhere, a guard clears his throat. Somewhere, a lamp gutters and someone shields it with a palm. Somewhere, a light breeze crosses a courtyard and dust lifts a finger's width and falls again. You leave the palace's shaded corridors and walk into the crackling dark of a war camp. The smell hits first smoke, sweat roasted yam leather, oiled against rain. Thousands of men sleep on mats or sit in circles, sharpening blades that already glint in the firelight. The ESO, the elite cavalry officers, move among them like shadows wrapped in authority. Their plumes catch fire glow. Their voices are low, and every gesture reminds you that here hierarchy is as tight as the cords that strap a horse's saddle. By day, these warriors charge with thunder. Their horses, armored in quilted cloth, surge across plains, and the dust of their hooves often settles before the news of battle even reaches the capital. But by night, they are human again. Fire circles shrink the world to a few faces, and dangers that seemed abstract in daylight now sit in your belly like stones. Imagine soldiers in a modern barracks joking to cover their fear before deployment. Oyo's warriors did the same, Only their jokes carried proverbs, and their laughter had a rhythm like drums, tapping reassurance. In these night circles, you notice bonds thicker than blood. Warriors sworn to each other's defense share not just rations but anxieties. They remind each other of home-tell stories from campaigns past and sometimes exchange gifts more personal than the spears they polish. Oral accounts hint at brothers in war who remained inseparable long after campaigns ended. No clerk wrote down what that meant in the privacy of tents, but human closeness has a way of ignoring the categories leaders later impose. You picture the ESO drinking palm wine cups, clinking eyes flashing with more than firelight. Their oaths were binding loyalty unto death. Can you really separate an oath to protect someone's body from the tenderness of protecting someone's spirit? Ancient chroniclers rarely said so outright, but you can read between their lines the way you read between texts from any culture. Where there is danger, there is dependence, and where dependence grows, affection follows. The army knew this too. It created rituals to channel such intensity. Initiations bound young warriors to older patrons' mentorships that blurred into something warmer in ways never spelled out. When you train side-by-side sweat, in the same sunfight with your back exposed to another's shield, you earn a trust deeper than titles. Modern soldiers talk about the band of brothers effect. Oyo's ESO had their own version centuries earlier. Even commanders seemed to understand. Some whispered names of generals who kept favorite companions close riding beside them, sharing their tents. Later, colonial observers uncomfortable with the implications chalked it up to African eccentricity, avoiding detail. Yet when you listen to Yoruba praise poetry, you hear metaphors of union and merging images of two flames burning brighter together. The poets, always cleverer than they pretended, slipped truths under the cover of metaphor. You might wonder, did ordinary soldiers notice? Of course. Markets the next day would buzz with rumors, and gossip traveled quicker than cavalry. A warrior seen leaving another's tent too often earned a nickname, sometimes affectionate, sometimes teasing. It is not so different from locker room jokes in modern sports teams, only sharpened by the knowledge that tomorrow's battle might make the bond permanent or end it. Humor in the camp was a shield, not a dagger. The fires crackle, and you watch men lean against each other's shoulders, touching as they doze. No one calls it intimacy. They call it keeping warm. But warmth does not ask for permission to carry meaning. In the hush after laughter, in the shared silence of men too tired to speak, you feel the camp pulse with unsaid things. Do you ever notice how silence among friends can feel louder than words? That was the soundtrack of Oyo's Army too. You recall how other empires managed their armies. Rome had its legions with strict codes. Medieval Europe had its knightly orders. And each time, historians find traces of relationships that blurred between comradeship and something deeper. Oyo fits into that long human pattern. Wherever you send young men into danger together, they find each other in ways that formal language prefers not to name. The war camp holds these secrets under its smoky roof of stars. Spears lean against logs, horses snort softly, and somewhere a drummer mutters a rhythm to himself, practicing for the dawn. You lie back on the ground, staring at the constellations Yoruba storytellers used as maps of destiny, and realize the night itself is listening. The fires fade low, but the bonds burning around them do not. Daylight lands differently when you step into the market. The palace was all hush and guarded glances, the war camp thick with smoke and loyalty oaths. But the market, it is noisy, crowded, and wonderfully cheeky. You hear voices pitching goods, goats, bleeding drummers, weaving rhythms with their palms, and somewhere a vendor swears her pepper is the hottest in town until her rival shouts back that his yam will make your soup so thick you could stand a spoon upright in it. You smell roasted maize, dried fish palm oil, and the faint sour tang of fermenting millet beer. The Oyo market was more than an economic engine. It was a stage. Women especially dominated the performance. They set prices, enforced guild rules, and made sure newcomers knew their place. But woven into the noise is a subtler texture codes, innuendo, and sly jokes that allowed people to say one thing and mean another. You might recognize the energy if you've ever watched street vendors in a modern city slip sarcasm into their sales pitches. It's a performance, a mask, and a message all at once. You pause at a spice stall, listening to laughter. A woman calls out a nickname at a passing man, something about his limp and his love for cola nuts. He blushes, the crowd giggles, and you realize the nickname has layers. Yoruba humor delights in double meanings, and sometimes those meanings point toward the unspoken world of who spends nights with whom. Nicknames, after all, are safer than accusations. They function like hashtags before hashtags existed compressed signals that everyone in the loop understands instantly. What happens when affection or desire can't be named openly? You dress it up in proverbs. A vendor might remark that the yam leans toward the steak that supports it, and half the crowd chuckles because they know she isn't just talking about farming. A man defending a friend too quickly might earn the teasing phrase, "The fire knows which wood feeds it." Humor keeps suspicion at bay. It turns what could be scandal into entertainment. You see apprentices darting between stalls, carrying baskets too heavy for their size. They swap jokes too mostly harmless, but sometimes edged. When an apprentice lingers around another's mat longer than expected, the older vendors raise eyebrows and start a new chain of gossip. You can almost hear echoes of today's office kitchen chatter when colleagues speculate over who is too friendly with whom. Different century, same human instinct. One story floats through oral history about a trader called Ayo, who traveled often to Porto Novo. He was said to bring back not only foreign cloth, but also foreign mannerisms. The phrase is deliberately vague, delivered with a smirk by storytellers even generations later. Did Ayo's friends tease him? Certainly. Did they also protect him by wrapping their teasing in ambiguity? Almost certainly. Markets, for all their chaos, could be safer spaces for coded existence than the rigid protocols of palace or camp. Guild mothers sometimes played referees in this banter. A sharp-tongued leader might silence an apprentice with a proverb that redirected the humor without shaming anyone outright. Their role wasn't just economic, it was social choreography. They knew when a joke cut too deep, when innuendo threatened to become dangerous, and they steered the energy back into safe laughter. That balancing act kept the market both lively and bearable. And think about this, markets were crossroads. Strangers passed through, accents mingled, and anonymity offered cover. A person could reinvent themselves here, at least for a morning, in ways impossible at home. Perhaps that is why gossip found such fertile soil. It was the price of playing with masks. Do you notice how even today, crowded transit hubs or flea markets let people experiment with personas they'd never risk in their own neighborhood? Oyo's marketplaces hummed with the same psychology. You keep moving, brushing against baskets of shea butter, hearing a griot recite lineage, while weaving in sly comments about who's spending too much time at another's stall. No one interrupts. Everyone laughs. The joke works because it hides in plain sight. The truth is never shouted, only sung, teased, or draped in metaphor. That is how communities survive the tension between conformity and human complexity, by wrapping the latter in humor. The market buzzes on a swarm of color and coded chatter. Somewhere, a boy chases a chicken, women argue theatrically over cloth, and a drummer strikes a beat that makes the crowd's shoulders sway. Noise covers secrets. Laughter softens judgment, and every proverb or nickname you overhear is another clue that human bonds have always found ways to slip through cracks even in the busiest of streets. Masks tell truths the face cannot. Picture the Igangun festival masqueraders swathed in shimmering cloth, layers upon layers fluttering as drums thunder and rattles hiss. The dead are said to walk again through these figures, ancestors advising and warning, yet also entertaining. You feel the energy in your bones, the swirl of colors, the shrieks of children, half frightened, half thrilled. And behind every mask is a body suddenly free of its ordinary name, a body licensed to dance, mock, and hint at things it could never risk in daylight without disguise. Festivals in Oyo were not quiet affairs. They bent the normal order. The Alafin might watch, chiefs might compete, but ordinary people, farmers, apprentices, market women, were drawn into the whirl too. Egungun spirits could scold the mighty or praise the humble. Humor was thick satire, sharper than any spear, and everyone accepted it because the mask gave permission. If you've ever seen a comedian roast a politician while the crowd howls, you already understand. Except here, the laughter hid something deeper, the chance to push against social walls without shattering them. That freedom extended to more personal frontiers. A masked dancer could lean close, gesture boldly, or improvise lines that teased at affections otherwise unspeakable. The anonymity protected him. No one would scold, because officially it wasn't him speaking, it was the ancestor spirit. Do you see how clever that is? People found shelter in the costume, a license to express hidden selves for a few blazing minutes. Then came Gelade, the festival of women's power and satirical masquerade. Costumes grew outrageous, oversized breasts, carved from wood masks, grinning with exaggerated features, performers lampooning gender roles with biting comedy. Crowds roared as men danced in female guise, celebrating and parodying womanhood at once. On the surface, it was laughter, but beneath it pulsed recognition. Gender in these moments was flexible. People could step outside their daily script and try on another without consequence. Anthropologists later described how Gelady masquerades could joke about relationships that polite society left unspoken. A performer might mimic the walk of a chief rumored to spend too much time with a younger attendant. The crowd laughed because the exaggeration turned rumor into comedy, yet the joke carried a sting of recognition. Humor allowed communities to confront the unsayable without turning it into scandal. You watch a masquerader spin cloth flying and realize how bodies become stories here. In ordinary life, posture and movement are controlled, policed by expectation. In masquerade, they explode outward. A man can sway his hips extravagantly, a boy can strut with exaggerated swagger, and the audience applauds. It is performance, but performance reveals possibilities. Haven't you ever noticed how Carnival or Halloween lets modern people slip masks on and suddenly act freer, braver, or sillier than usual? Oyo's festivals carried the same magic centuries earlier. Consider the role of satire. When a masked figure mimicked intimacy between warriors or attendants, the laughter was doubled amusement on the surface recognition underneath. Everyone could deny they believed it, yet everyone remembered the joke. In that way, the masquerade became both release valve and archive storing whispers in the safe vault of performance. It was as if society agreed, we know, but we will only admit it when the drums are loud enough to drown us out. Not all masks hid play. Some carried sacred weight. The spirit of Sango, god of thunder, demanded respect. Performers invoking him moved with power, and audiences responded with awe. Yet even within that seriousness, the costume reminded you that identity is layered. The same man who commanded thunder by day could behind a mask suggest other truths with a tilt of the head or a sly step. The night grows hotter, the drumming faster, and you sense how disguise both conceals and reveals. A boy chasing a masquerader believes he is chasing an ancestor. A young woman teased by a masked dancer laughs, while wondering whose eyes flicker behind the cloth. In the blur of rhythm and costume, possibilities bloom. Society pretends to forget in the morning, but the memory lingers, like ash after fire, silent, soft, but undeniable. If palaces wrap tenderness in ceremony, and festivals draped it in cloth, poets smuggled it through words, you settle near a gathering where an Orokan royal praise singer clears his throat, tilts his drum, and begins a cascade of proverbs that tumble like river stones. His job is to exalt the king, yet his phrases meander, doubling back, weaving in comparisons that make you lean forward, trying to catch the second meaning, hiding behind the first. Yoruba poetry thrived on ambiguity. A line praising a warrior's courage might also wink at his beauty. A proverb celebrating unity could slide into an image of two bodies entwined like vines. Do you remember when you've heard a pop song on the radio that sounded innocent until you caught the subtext, same trick, different century? Listeners in Oyo were masters of catching what was tucked between syllables. You imagine the court audience chiefs nodding solemnly, women traders murmuring agreement, the Alafin himself smiling at the flattery. But scattered among the proverbs are sly darts that everyone tends to miss. An Orokan might remark that the drum and the drummer cannot part even when night is long. To some, it's just a poetic image. To others, it's a commentary on a relationship everyone has been whispering about. Words become smoke, visible fragrant, but impossible to grab. Praise singers weren't the only ones with license. Market jesters, wandering bards, and even drummers enjoyed similar freedom. They could insert double doors into their verses, one leading to safe literal meaning, the other swinging open toward the unsayable. If challenged, they shrugged and said, "It's only a proverb." That plausible deniability kept satire alive, much like stand-up comics today. Test the limits of what they can say on stage. Some examples survive in oral tradition. A poem praising Oya, goddess of winds, described her as dancing between wives and husbands, never fully caught by either. The surface meaning honored her restless power. The undertone nodded to fluidity that communities recognized but rarely discussed openly. Audiences laughed knowingly, not because it was scandalous, but because the poet had turned what was whispered into art. Historical figures sometimes slipped into these verses too. One Alafin was said to favor a young page whose name appeared in a song disguised by metaphor. Singers compared the pair to thunder, finding its lightning a phrase that sounds like cosmic flattery, yet carried a sly wink. Did the king notice? Almost certainly. Did he mind? Perhaps not. Power allows indulgence, and poetry gave him cover. You notice how much weight rests on tone. The same proverb could be delivered as solemn truth or as a mischievous aside, depending on how the drum punctuated it. Audiences became attuned to these cues. A pause too long, a chuckle at the wrong place, and suddenly everyone heard the joke beneath the praise. It turned listening into a game one where everyone pretended innocence but savored the double edge. In many ways, Yoruba literature resembles Shakespeare's plays, dense with innuendo, layered with bawd humor, designed to entertain both the elite and the common crowd. Think of Mercutio's wordplay, or the clown scenes in Othello lines that seem harmless unless you tilt your ear just right. Oyo's poets mastered the same craft, ensuring their art resonated at multiple frequencies at once. As you sit with the Arakan's voice echoing against clay walls, you realize that poetry here isn't decoration. It is camouflage. It hides truths in rhythm, so that even if scribes never wrote them down, listeners carried them in memory. The words drift on the night air, scattering like sparks from a torch, and each listener catches a different flame. You drift from the marketplace's jokes and the poet's sly proverbs into the hushed, smoky air of shrines. Temples smell of palm oil, roasted fowl, and the iron tang of blood from sacrifices. Drums are quieter here, steady, almost heartbeat-like, and you realize this is not entertainment, but negotiation with the unseen. In these spaces, gender is not fixed. It bends, expands, and sometimes flips entirely. Spirits have never cared much for human categories, and you see how their worship made room for lives that didn't fit the straight lines society drew. Take Sango, the Thunder King. His cult was famous for spectacle fire, drumming dancing that bordered on frenzy. Devotees called him both fierce and magnetic. His myths often place him at the center of passionate relationships, not all of them neat. He is said to have loved fiercely, even destructively, with a power that blurred boundaries of what was acceptable. When his priests danced, sparks flying from whips, did the bodies not echo that uncontainable desire? You feel the crowd both thrilled and nervous, caught between awe and recognition. Then comes Oya, goddess of winds, and river whirlpools, wife and rival of Sango. She embodied restlessness, change, and multiplicity. Stories claim she could take male form in battle, wielding weapons with a ferocity that unsettled those who expected women to stay in domestic shadows. Her worshippers absorbed that license. In possession trance, a devotee might shift posture, voice dropping into tone that startled family members. For a night, boundaries dissolved. Man became woman, woman became storm, and no one dared mock it, because to do so was to risk divine wrath. And then there is Yesu, the trickster. He delights in confusion, in flipping expectations. His shrines sit at crossroads, painted with red and black feathers stuck into clay. Devotees call him messenger, yet he is also the patron of ambiguity. If someone in Oyo lived differently, Yesu's shadow offered a kind of protection. After all, who would dare shame what the trickster god himself embodied? Imagine a divine stamp of approval on breaking rules, not permission exactly, but a shield of unpredictability. Foreign observers noticed this and grew uneasy. Islamic clerks muttered about pagan excess. Christian missionaries fumbled for condemnations. But for centuries before their arrival, Yoruba religion had already stretched gender and desire beyond single categories. Priests might dress in robes, considered feminine mediums, might channel gods of opposite sex, and the community accepted it because sacred space suspends ordinary judgment. Haven't you ever noticed How even in modern churches or temples, worship sometimes frees people to cry sway or shout in ways they never would. At the office, Oyo's shrines magnified that by divine design. The sacred also created stories that people carried into daily life. Proverbs about Sango's fiery passions or Oya's shifting forms circulated in gossip. A mother warning her daughter about a volatile suitor might compare him to the thunder god. A friend joking about someone's changeable moods might invoke Oya. These references quietly normalize the idea that love and identity could be more fluid than officials admitted. Some shrines kept artifacts that embodied this ambiguity. Carved figures of paired male attendants, their arms around each other, survived in collections long after colonial rule tried to erase the context. To foreign curators, they were curiosities. To local worshippers, they were reminders that the gods did not punish affection simply because it did not match social codes. If heaven tolerated complexity, why should earth be harsher? You step closer to an altar, watching a priestess swirl cowries in her hand, her chant climbing and dropping like a tide. The crowd sways with her rhythm. A young man beside you suddenly begins to shake his eyes, rolling back, and within moments his voice is not his own. He speaks in a tone that echoes thunder, commanding respect. No one mocks that his gestures are unmanly, or that his hips sway as if pulled by invisible strings. He is not himself now. He is vessel, and that vessel cannot be judged by human measure. As night deepens, the shrines glow with torchlight shadows of carved figures dancing across clay walls. Spirits roam, priests chant, and the air is thick with both reverence and release. Here, the unsayable does not need words. It is carried in trance in myth, in carved wood and rattling drums. You realize the sacred was not just a refuge. It was an archive preserving truths that rulers and later colonizers preferred to erase. And the archive still hums if you know how to listen. Secrets often hide best in plain sight, and nowhere was that truer than in Oyo's compounds. Imagine stepping through the wooden gate of a sprawling household, mud walls, circling courtyards, chickens darting between cooking pots, children weaving through pillars, while elders gossip under shade. It looks ordinary, almost chaotic. But behind the rhythm of daily chores lies another rhythm, quieter, more personal, that has as much to do with who sleeps beside whom, as with who tills which field. In Oyo, every household was an archive of whispers, and apprenticeships, mentorships, and protection often blurred into affections that defied tidy labels. You see it most clearly in the way compounds doubled as schools. A young boy, apprenticed to a craftsman, might sleep side by side with older youths, all of them crammed into a single room on mats. Warmth was necessity, but warmth is never just temperature. Masters carried weight, not just as teachers, but as guardians. An apprentice relied on him for food, shelter, guidance, and sometimes more. Oral traditions recall wards, who became favorites, protected more fiercely than others given better cloth or lighter duties. Was that favoritism? Certainly. Was it also attachment that dared not speak its full name? Very likely. History doesn't hand you photographs, only shadows, and it's in the shadows that you sense the texture of intimacy. Picture the evenings. Oil lamps sputter. The compound grows quiet, except for distant drumming from another quarter. Apprentices lie shoulder to shoulder. Mats press so close the line between one body and another is blurred. A cough, a laugh, a whispered story ripple through the dark. Even if no one calls it by name, bonds thicken under those roofs. You can almost hear it in the silence between words, the same way you hear tension in a pause during modern reality shows, unsaid but unmistakable. Women's compounds had their own versions. Senior wives trained junior wives in the etiquette of household management, a relationship heavy with hierarchy, but often also with tenderness. In Galeta festivals, you saw men parodying this closeness on stage. In households, it was lived daily. Oral accounts hint at pairs of women whose companionship outlasted marriages, the kind of enduring alliance that gossip nods at but never puts fully into words. Do you think neighbors didn't notice when two women fetched water together every day long after their chores could have been divided? They noticed. They just folded it into the fabric of friendship. Even political households carried these dynamics. Chiefs hosted wards from allied families, a form of political insurance. These wards often lived for years under another man's roof, treated as sons, but also as companions. Friendships formed here could later tilt alliances, shaping which side a chief chose in conflict. Loyalty forged on shared mats turned into loyalty expressed on battlefields. Bonds of affection then were never just private. They shaped the map of Oyo politics in ways historians rarely highlight. You think of modern parallels, college dorms, military barracks, summer camps. Stick people in close quarters with shared dependence and relationships form that blur every neat category. Oyo's compounds were that principle multiplied across an empire. Every household was both school and stage teaching etiquette, while also letting human hearts improvise. Archaeologists find clues in the smallest things: paired cooking pots, where one would suffice carved stools showing two figures with arms linked. Colonial record keepers rarely commented, but local storytellers remembered. They remembered masters who favored one apprentice senior wives, who preferred one another's company chiefs, whose wards defended them with unusual zeal. These fragments pile into a picture you can't dismiss, even if no one source spells it outright. The compound, then, was not only a building, but a crucible. Every courtyard held echoes of laughter and quarrels. Every sleeping room held memories pressed into mats. The walls did not gossip, but they remembered holding warmth long after the fires burned out. And in that remembered warmth, you find one more chapter of Oyo's untold story. Road dust clings to your sandals as you follow a caravan winding out of Oyo's gates. Horses snort, donkeys bray under their loads, and traders call instructions in half a dozen dialects. You feel the empire stretch outward here toward coastal ports, toward the savannas of Hausaland, toward the towns where cola nuts, cloth, and human cargo shifted hands. Travel is exhausting, but it is also liberating. Far from palace eyes and compound gossip, people test new boundaries. Strangers bring permission. When you meet someone whose family doesn't know yours, you can laugh more freely, lean a little closer, and invent a new version of yourself. Caravans created that space. At roadside inns, mats were rolled out in long lines, bodies pressed together for warmth, and travelers swapped stories until the fire died. Some tales were about trade routes or bandit attacks. Others, more personal, slipped into jokes and teasing that only made sense because tomorrow everyone would part ways. The coast amplified this. At Porto Novo, at Lagos, at Whydah, the mix of accents was dizzying: Fon Portuguese, English, Hausa, Igbo. Markets thrummed with goods and gossip. A trader from Oyo could vanish into that crowd, try on new habits, and no one at home would ever know. Oral hints described friendships of the road that were intense but fleeting. Colonial scribes, uncomfortable with ambiguity, dismissed them as curious customs. Yet anyone who has traveled knows the peculiar intimacy of sharing long journeys with strangers. Even warriors experienced it. Campaigns often marched hundreds of miles. Nights in foreign villages blurred hierarchy. Officers and soldiers, exhausted, shared the same roofs, ate from the same bowls. In those conditions, closeness flourished that would have been suspect back in Oyo. Soldiers joked about it in songs the army never performed at court, but that everyone knew. Ports, too, carried their own reputations. The slave trade cast a long shadow, pulling Oyo into Atlantic networks. Alongside tragedy came cultural mingling, music, fashion, even gestures. Foreign sailors brought not just goods, but new ways of being. Stories survive of Oyo men who dressed differently after trading voyages, walked with new swagger, or adopted habits that sparked laughter back home. He has eaten the sea, neighbors would say, a phrase that implied more than just salty air. Think of today's airports, where anonymity allows people to test versions of themselves. A businessman loosens his tie at a layover. A student dyes her hair on a backpacking trip. A couple holds hands in a city where no one knows them. Oyo's ports and caravan inns gave the same freedom centuries earlier. For some, that freedom meant slipping into affections unmonitored. Known distance would cover their tracks. Not all encounters were temporary. Oral tales remember traders who formed lasting bonds across ethnic lines, alliances sealed not only by contracts, but by companionship. Some men returned again and again to the same coastal house, hosted by the same partner, their friendship whispered about in markets far inland. Was it business? Was it more? Listeners still shrug centuries later. But the very ambiguity testifies to possibilities wider than official histories admit. You stand at the edge of the lagoon, watching canoes cut across water silvered by moonlight. The port is restless, full of songs half drowned by waves, full of secrets that never travel back inland. The empire's heart beats in Oyo, but its pulse races here where strangers blur the lines, and intimacy finds room in the crowd. Paper arrives like an intruder. You see clerks with ink-stained fingers, men who speak Arabic or English bending over ledgers. For generations, memory lived in drums, in chants, and carved figures. Now it lives in notebooks, lined with columns, categories, and signatures. With that change comes a new gaze, one that insists on recording, judging, classifying. And suddenly, the old intimacies that slipped unnoticed in compounds, markets, or shrines are being pinned down like insects under glass. Islam had reached Oyo before the Europeans. Scribes in flowing robes copied Quranic verses, and imams preached sermons that stressed propriety. Their presence reshaped households, urging stricter lines between men and women, between public and private. Yet even here, the story is complicated. Some converts adapted Islam with Yoruba flexibility, attending mosque on Friday, but still keeping shrines at home. Others took the new rules seriously and began to frown at practices once taken for granted. Whispered bonds among apprentices, playful jokes at markets, or affectionate mentorships now carried sharper risk. Then came the Christians. Missionaries opened schools, and with them came a flood of Victorian ideals. To their ears, Yoruba proverbs sounded dangerous, masquerades scandalous, and shrine possession demonic. They wrote reports cataloging immoral customs and trained young converts to repeat the same condemnations. You can almost hear the clash, Yoruba laughter sly, and knowing meeting missionary frowns stiff enough to crack glass. Where poetry once smuggled truths, now school primers taught children to deny them. Colonial officials joined the chorus. They sat in courtrooms, declaring laws that criminalized behaviors never before treated as crimes. What had been tolerated, even celebrated in coded form, now risked punishment. A nickname that once made the market laugh could become evidence in a case. Imagine the chill that settled a joke no longer safe, a gesture suddenly suspicious, a relationship reduced to a line in an official's notebook. Yet human beings are stubborn. Did the whispers stop? Of course not. They went underground, mutating into subtler codes. Market women still sang satirical songs, but now they dropped certain words. Let pauses do the work. Warriors still swore brotherhood, but spoke it with extra solemnity. Priests still danced in possession, but some shrines locked their doors tighter. If you've ever seen how humor adapts under censorship, how comedians today slip critiques into harmless anecdotes, you know the same survival instinct at play. Some stories of resistance survive. One chief, confronted by a missionary about unnatural attachments in his household, retorted, "If my house pleases my God and my people, why should it trouble you?" The missionary wrote it down as insolence. To later readers, it sounds like dignity refusing erasure. Ordinary people were just as clever. They cloaked their affections in kinship terms, calling companions brother or cousin, even as everyone knew the bond was thicker than blood. The irony colonial officials often misunderstood. Reports in the archives describe Oyo men walking hand in hand and interpret it as friendship missing undertones. Or they describe warriors inseparable in camp and chalk it up to discipline. Their cultural blinkers both criminalized and misread, a contradiction that left space for lives to continue in the gaps. You sit with this tension, a society that once wrapped ambiguity in proverb, now forced to wrap it in silence. Yet even silence has a sound if you listen closely. A smile, too quick a proverb, cut short a drum rhythm, that lingers on a note, all become archives of resilience. The empire was shifting under the weight of Islam, Christianity, and colonial law, but beneath the paper and ink, the older frequencies still hummed. History does not erase what bodies remember. You stand now at the edge of the story, where archives thin and laws shift, but the echoes of Oyo still hum in jokes. Glances and memories passed quietly from mouth to ear. Even after officials criminalized missionaries condemned, and scribes rewrote, people kept their own ledgers not on paper, but in laughter, nicknames, and silences that said more than sermons ever could. Memory lingers in unexpected places. An old stool carved with two figures side by side, dismissed by a colonial cataloger as decorative, carries whispers of affection once celebrated. A proverb half forgotten, still muttered by elders, reminds you that the yam bends toward the stake it chooses. Children laugh at the rhyme without grasping the undertone, yet the undertone survives tucked into language itself. Culture hides what it cannot shout, the way embers glow long after firewood is ash. You think of modern Yoruba communities, where Gelede still parades satirical masks, where drums still beat proverbs into the night. Outsiders film the color, the spectacle, but insiders catch the innuendo, just as their ancestors did. Humor, satire, and ritual remain shields against forgetting. If you have ever smiled at a family joke that outsiders would never decode, you understand exactly how these codes endure. The colonial lens tried to flatten intimacy into scandal, to redraw human complexity into categories of crime. Yet families kept their own archives. Mothers warned daughters with proverbs laced in double meanings. Friends teased each other with nicknames that preserved memories of older bonds. Even in churches and mosques, worshippers sometimes hummed old songs under their breath, slipping memory past the walls of doctrine. That persistence is itself testimony. No empire, foreign or domestic, could silence every drum. You remember the palace Ilari, who knew more than they admitted, the warriors who swore brotherhood by firelight, the market women who laughed in codes, the masked dancers who spun freedom in cloth, the poets who stitched ambiguity into praise, the shrines that bent gender like wind through branches, the compounds that sheltered apprentices in warmth, the ports where strangers granted permission, and the clerks who tried and failed to cage all this in ink. Each setting carried the same truth. People are endlessly inventive in finding ways to be human together. Isn't that the heart of the untold history? That what could not be said openly was still lived, still felt, still remembered. That human desire, loyalty, and tenderness always leak through cracks, no matter how thick the wall. You can almost hear the Oyo drums, agreeing their rhythms curling through centuries, laughing at the arrogance of paper laws. The story ends, but the echoes don't. Somewhere, a child still hears an elder mutter a proverb with a knowing smile. Somewhere, a festival mask still winks through cloth. Somewhere, the warmth of a crowded room still blurs the line between duty and affection. The empire has passed. The walls have crumbled, but the untold history lingers like dust in sunlight, visible only if you pause long enough to watch it dance. We have just learned about homosexuality in the Oyo Empire. What do you think about it? Do you believe it is true? Whether it is or not, please leave a comment so everyone can discuss it together. Now let's explore another aspect of the Oyo Empire, its military power. You can almost hear it before you see it. The heavy thud of hooves, the jingling of harness bells, the sharp snorts of restless stallions. Imagine standing on the flat plains of Yorubaland, where the Oyo Empire carved out its power, and suddenly a wall of horses gallops toward you. This isn't just any cavalry. This is the heartbeat of Oyo's military strength, the reason rival kingdoms whispered about their might and feared their sudden charge. Horses weren't native to this part of West Africa, and that's what makes their presence so impressive. They had to be brought down from the north through trade networks stretching into Hausaland and even beyond the Sahara. Every single stallion represented not just an animal, but a logistical triumph, a symbol of wealth, and a weapon of terror all rolled into one. Picture yourself as an ordinary villager watching them thunder by. The dust alone could choke you. The ground shakes as if the gods are stomping their feet, and for a moment you wonder if this is even human warfare or some divine storm loosed from the sky. Horses gave Oyo the speed and shock value that infantry alone could never achieve. When the enemy still lined up their men with spears and shields, Oyo's cavalry swept around them, cutting lines, scattering formations, and making even the boldest warriors break ranks. It's almost unfair. Like bringing a motorbike into a marathon, your legs just can't keep up. Of course, horses weren't just about brute speed. They required enormous care. These animals needed stables, water fodder, and constant grooming in a climate that wasn't exactly friendly to them. Oyo horse handlers were experts at keeping them alive in humid heat, where many animals might falter. If you've ever tried to keep an imported houseplant alive in the wrong season, you'll understand the struggle. But Oyo didn't just keep them alive, they turned them into a professional arm of the military. The sight of a cavalryman in his gear with leather armor gleaming and weapons strapped across his back was enough to make opponents rethink their life choices. Think of the symbolism. A horse wasn't simply a ride, it was a throne on legs. Only the elite could fight on horseback, which meant it doubled as a marker of social status. The Oyo nobility used horses not just to dominate the battlefield, but to announce their own authority. To ride in front of your army on horseback was to declare, I command not just men, but beasts, not just swords, but speed itself. Does that remind you of modern parades, where tanks roll past the crowd, steel giants humming as a show of strength? Oyo had their version in horse cavalry, living machines of war, paraded before subjects to inspire loyalty, and before enemies to inspire dread. It wasn't all glamour, though. Horses were expensive, and feeding them often drained resources. Grains had to be imported, pastures had to be maintained, and the constant wars meant a constant need for replacement. Yet this very expense underscored their importance. If you're willing to pour that much into an animal, it must be giving you a return worth the sacrifice. And indeed, Oyo's reach across Yorubaland and beyond would have been impossible without those hooves pounding the earth. Here's a fun question for you. If you had to stand your ground against an Oyo cavalry charge with nothing but a spear and a wooden shield, how many seconds would you last before deciding, you know what, today's not my day? Probably not long. Cavalry had that kind of psychological power. Long before they even reached striking distance, the sound and sight of them had already half won the battle. But the cavalry wasn't just a random mob of horsemen. They were drilled, disciplined, and integrated into the empire's chain of command. The king's generals knew how to use them in combination with infantry. Scouts went ahead to track the enemy riders, swept in to disrupt, and foot soldiers moved in to finish. It was choreography on an open-air stage, and the drum beats in the background kept rhythm like a live soundtrack. Remember, the way movie soundtracks raise your heartbeat before the monster even appears on screen. That was the role of Oyo's horsemen. The tension before the strike, the panic once it landed. Over time, neighboring states began to copy the cavalry model, but Oyo had the advantage of being the first mover in the region. Their wealth, their access to northern trade, and their organizational structure allowed them to scale cavalry power like no one else. It was an arms race, where instead of missiles or jets, the deciding factor was who had more horses, better riders, and sharper coordination. And for a long stretch of the 17th and 18th centuries, Oyo was unbeatable on that score. Even in diplomacy, the horse was a bargaining chip. Gifts of horses, demands for tribute in horses, and the prestige of owning rare breeds all circulated in Oyo's corridors of power. When a vassal state delivered horses to the Alafin, it wasn't just paying taxes, it was acknowledging dependence on Oyo's superior military engine. You can imagine the mix of pride and resentment that stirred pride in being part of the great empire, resentment at having to supply the very weapons that could later be used to crush any rebellion. The cavalry became so intertwined with Oyo's identity that you can't tell the story of its rise without them. And yet, as mighty as they were, the horsemen weren't the whole story. The cavalry might deliver the shock, but who ensured that every rider knew when to strike and how to die with honor if necessary? For that, you'd have to look to the Iso warriors, the fearless corps whose code bound them more tightly than any saddle ever could. You find yourself standing among the Iso warriors, and instantly the atmosphere feels different from the thunder of horses. These men aren't just fighters. They are living oaths, walking embodiments of loyalty sealed with blood and honor. They are known as the Iso, the Imperial Guard of the Oyo Empire, and their code is simple but terrifying. Never show cowardice, never retreat. And if defeat comes, you must choose death over dishonor. It sounds almost theatrical, but in practice it meant that once you joined their ranks, your life no longer belonged to you. It belonged to the Empire. Imagine the scene: a young warrior, barely into manhood, kneels before elders to take the oath. Around him, senior Iso stand with spears planted like flagpoles, watching with unreadable eyes. He swears to fight until the last breath, to never be captured alive, to never shame his king. In modern terms, it's like signing a lifetime contract with no escape clause. You don't quit. You don't retire peacefully. And if things go badly on the battlefield, your final act must be to fall on your own sword, or in Oyo's case, your own spear. Now you might think, why would anyone agree to this? Well, in exchange, the Iso gained unmatched prestige. They lived close to the Alafin's court, enjoyed privileges ordinary warriors could only dream of, and carried a reputation that turned their very names into weapons. The moment villagers heard an Iso detachment was marching nearby, they whispered and pointed as if gods in human form were passing. Have you ever noticed how modern elite soldiers like commandos or special forces carry a kind of aura? Even if you've never seen them fight, the uniform alone makes you step aside. That's the effect the Iso had in 17th century Yoruba land. Their presence on the battlefield was like a stamp of seriousness. If the Iso were deployed, you knew this wasn't just a skirmish. This was a fight the Empire considered worth everything. And because their code demanded absolute bravery, they often took the riskiest positions, charging the enemy lines head-on or staying behind to cover retreats, even when they knew the cost would be fatal. There's a strange mix of admiration and dread in watching men who are trained, almost conditioned, to embrace their deaths without flinching. The Alafin depended on them as both bodyguards and shock troops. In peacetime, they patrolled the palace, stood guard at ceremonies, and acted as living symbols of the king's reach. In wartime, they became the spear tip, the first to meet the clash. This dual role meant they were visible in everyday life as well as in war, which only reinforced their mystique. Ordinary farmers or merchants might never see a full cavalry charge, but they might see an Iso striding through the marketplace, and that was enough to remind everyone of Oyo's muscle. The Iso also served as a moral compass, or perhaps more accurately, a moral pressure. Their code rubbed off on other soldiers, raising expectations. If even one Iso turned and fled, it would scandalize the Empire. But because their code demanded the opposite, their courage forced regular troops to stiffen their spines and follow through. Think of it as peer pressure, but with deadly consequences if you failed. If you've ever tried to keep up with a marathon runner friend, even though your lungs were screaming, you get a faint sense of that feeling. There are stories of Iso who, when cornered, chose dramatic exits to maintain honor. Some are said to have sung songs while marching into hopeless battles, others to have mocked their enemies as spears closed in. Whether all these tales are fact or embellished legend, they fed into the mythology of the Iso, making them larger than life. And mythology, as any good ruler knows, is just as important as raw numbers in keeping an army together. It's worth noting that the Iso were not simply hot-headed daredevils. Their training and discipline were legendary. They knew how to hold formation, how to coordinate with cavalry and infantry, and how to listen to drum signals that carried commands across fields. Their willingness to die did not make them reckless. It made them reliable. A general could count on them to hold a position until the very last man, which is the kind of grim assurance that can turn the tide of a battle. But here's the twist: their code also made them dangerous to their own leaders. An Eso, who felt dishonored by the king, could turn his oath into a weapon, choosing death in protest by committing suicide in public. This act, dramatic as it sounds, was not just personal, it was a political statement. It shouted to everyone watching that the Alafin had failed in some way. The weight of that accusation could rattle a king's legitimacy more than any enemy arrow. So the very warriors who embodied loyalty also became in their deaths instruments of accountability. As you stand among them, the question sneaks into your mind: could you live with that kind of oath? Could you sleep at night knowing that tomorrow might be your final stand, and that retreat is not even an option on the menu? The Eso lived with that tension daily and somehow turned it into strength. And while the horsemen carried Oyo's speed, it was the Eso who carried its soul, shaping not just the empire's battles, but its very idea of honor. And if the Eso embodied honor in flesh and blood, then the Alafin and his council embodied power and strategy, making the decisions that decided when these warriors would ride, fight, fall. You step into the royal compound of Oyo, where power doesn't look like thunderous hooves or fearless Eso chants, but instead like measured words, hushed debates, and decisions that ripple across the empire. The Alafin, the king of Oyo, sits at the center of it all, wrapped in regalia that makes him look less like a man and more like an institution. Yet, despite all the gold and ceremony, he isn't free to simply snap his fingers and unleash armies. That's where the balance comes in, for the Alafin's power was checked by a council known as the Oyo Mesi, a group of 7 chiefs who acted as the brakes on the king's engine. It's a strange sight if you expect absolute monarchy. Here the Alafin could command, but his commands had to echo in harmony with the voices of his council. The Bassarin, the head of the Oyo Mesi, carried especially sharp influence. Picture him like the speaker of a parliament, but with the authority to challenge the king himself. If the Alafin ever grew too arrogant or reckless, the Oyo Mesi could pressure him to abdicate politely at first, then not so politely. And in a society where even Eso warriors could dramatize discontent by embracing death, the political consequences of losing the council's favor were deadly serious. Now imagine the council chamber during a war council. The Alafin wants to send the cavalry eastward against rebellious vassals, but the Oyo Mesi weigh in. They consider whether the treasury can afford it, whether the crops will support the campaign, whether the gods consulted through the Ifa priests give their blessing. You can almost hear the tension, one man thundering for decisive action, others murmuring about caution, resources, and omens. This tug of war made Oyo's military decisions less impulsive and more sustainable. After all, even the strongest empire collapses if its king acts like a gambler, betting everything on one throw. Do you ever notice how in modern politics, leaders must balance between ambition and advisors who warn them of limits? The Alafin lived that balancing act daily. Too timid, and his army looked weak. Too bold, and he risked angering both his council and his gods. It was a high-wire act, and the Oyo Mesi made sure the rope was never wide enough for comfort. Yet this wasn't paralysis. When king and council aligned, Oyo moved with terrifying efficiency. Orders cascaded down through the provincial chiefs' garrisons, prepared supplies. Iso warriors polished their weapons, and cavalrymen tightened saddles. This was coordination at a grand scale, and it allowed Oyo to project power far beyond its immediate borders. Other states may have had brave warriors or tough leaders, but few had such a finely tuned machine of strategy, politics, and military muscle all woven together. You might wonder, what if the Alafin simply ignored the Oyo Mesi? Theoretically, he could try, but in practice, that would be suicide. The council controlled not only political legitimacy, but also access to the Ogboni, a powerful, secretive society with religious clout. Together, they could pull the rug out from under any king, stripping him of divine backing. A king without divine sanction in Oyo was like a phone without a battery. It looked impressive, but it was dead weight. The Basoran in particular held a dagger of influence. There's a famous tradition where, if the Oyo Mesi decided the Alafin had to go, they presented him with an empty calabash or a parrot's egg, a symbolic way of saying, "Your reign is over, and you must take your own life." It's grim? Yes. But it kept the system from descending into tyranny. Even the most glorious king knew his chair was balanced on a trapdoor, ready to open if he lost the trust of his chiefs. Does that remind you of modern companies where CEOs are celebrated until the board of directors decides otherwise? Same pressure, just with higher stakes. This constant negotiation didn't weaken Oyo. It made it flexible. The Alafin could not rule like a dictator. But as the ultimate decision maker, shaped by council checks, he stood as both symbol and strategist. His voice carried the authority of divine kingship, while the council's involvement ensured the army wasn't bled dry on vanity wars. And when the drums beat across Yorubaland, calling warriors to assemble, it was because a consensus, sometimes grudging, sometimes enthusiastic, had been reached at the top. The empire's military success then wasn't only about weapons and warriors. It was about governance, the careful orchestration of competing voices that produced decisions both bold and calculated. You might think of it like a band, the Alafin as the lead singer, dramatic and commanding, but the Oyo Mesi as the rhythm section keeping time, making sure the performance doesn't spiral into chaos. Without them, the music would be noise. And if this council of chiefs could shape war through words, the empire also shaped its strength through bricks gates and walls, building fortified towns and border garrisons that turned strategy into lived reality. What good is an empire with mighty horses and fearless warriors if your own capital could be overrun in a single night? That's why Oyo didn't just fight wars, it built walls, gates and garrisons that made the empire feel like a fortress spread across the plains. You walk through one of these fortified towns, and the first thing you notice isn't the noise of the market, but the looming earth walls rising like baked clay waves around the settlement. These weren't the delicate stone castles of Europe. They were raw, practical ramparts, piled high from trenches dug by thousands of hands, reinforced with timber palisades and topped with thorny barriers that made any assault a nightmare. Imagine trudging up to one of these walls as an enemy. By the time you reach the base, your feet are tangled in brush arrows are raining down, and slingers are pelting you with stones. Even if you bring ladders, those walls have enough defenders perched above to knock you back faster than you climbed. The psychological message is clear. Oyo was not only mobile in the field, it was immovable at home. And it wasn't just the capital at Oyo Ile. Smaller towns and border outposts were fortified too, creating a chain of defenses like links in a giant iron bracelet. as you pass through one of the capital's massive gates, you realize how clever the design is. The gateways are narrow, forcing crowds to filter in slowly, and angled paths make it impossible for cavalry to charge straight through. Traders and farmers line up, guards check movements, and the whole thing feels like a customs checkpoint centuries before passports. Do you think a medieval traveler felt more awe at the sight of these gates, or more irritation at waiting for inspection? Either way, the point was control of who entered, what goods they carried, and whether friend or foe was crossing that line. The garrison towns, especially along the empire's borders, tell another story. These weren't just sleepy posts with a few guards nodding off by the fire. They were military communities in themselves, full of soldiers, their families, stables, training fields, and armories. A garrison like that wasn't merely defensive. It was a springboard for offense, allowing Oyo to launch raids or expeditions quickly, without dragging men all the way from the capital. You can almost smell the sweat of horses being brushed, the clang of weapons being sharpened, the nervous excitement when scouts returned with news of enemy movement. One of the most fascinating aspects of Oyo's military architecture is how it tied into daily life. The fortifications weren't only for war, they shaped how people lived. Markets sprang up near walls, travelers camped by gates, and even religious rituals sometimes took place at these boundaries, blurring the line between sacred and military. Think of it like modern cities, where train stations double as shopping malls and cultural hubs. In Oyo, the walls did more than protect, they organized society. But don't imagine these defenses were impenetrable. History shows that determined enemies eventually tested and sometimes breached them. Yet their mere existence slowed invasions, bought time, and forced attackers into costly gambles. And in an age when time could mean the difference between reinforcement arriving or a capital falling, that delay was worth its weight in gold. Standing on top of a wall, you can look out across miles of countryside. Villages dot the horizon. Roads snake away like brown veins, and somewhere out there, rival armies plot. From up here, though, you feel secure, perched above the threat. You might even laugh a little, thinking of attackers sweating and cursing below. Isn't it funny how walls can turn fear into confidence with just a few meters of dirt and timber? The fortified strength of Oyo also had symbolic power. Walls said, "We are here to stay." They weren't temporary camps or nomadic tents. They were permanents in earth and wood. For subjects, that permanence built pride. For enemies, it built dread. And if you've ever driven past a stadium before a big game, seeing the sheer size of it looming ahead, you'll understand the mix of awe and intimidation these walls produced in their time. And yet fortifications alone didn't fill the empire's treasury or extend its borders. To keep horses fed, Iso warriors honored, and walls maintained, Oyo needed constant fuel wealth. And wealth came most dramatically from the campaigns of expansion raids, conquests, and the grim business of capturing people to power its trade networks. You march out from the safety of the garrisons, and suddenly the air changes. No more marketplace chatter, no more comfortable walls, just the long lines of soldiers stretching into the distance, drums thumping a rhythm that promises something harsh ahead. Expansion was the heartbeat of Oyo's power, and raids were its constant pulse. Armies didn't just fight to defend. They fought to enrich. Horses and Iso warriors led the way, sweeping into enemy lands, scattering villages, and pulling in captives who would later feed Oyo's booming trade. It's unsettling when you think about it. Because the very same empire that dazzled with walls and pageantry also thrived on aggressive campaigns. Victories brought tribute from vassal states, grain cloth, cattle, and above all, people. Captives were marched back to the capital or traded to merchants who linked Oyo to wider Atlantic markets. The military became, in a way, the engine of an economy that tied Yorubaland to distant coasts where Europeans waited with ships. If you think of war today as draining a nation's wealth, here it was the opposite war, created wealth, filling treasuries, markets, and storehouses. Now picture yourself as a villager in a small town bordering Oyo's territory. You hear the ground shaking, and before you even know who is attacking, the sight of horsemen makes your knees wobble. Resistance futile. Oyo's cavalry could chase down runners. Their Izo warriors could burn through resistance, and before sunrise, your fate was sealed. It's easy to sit centuries later and imagine rebellion or defiance. But at the time, facing Oyo's war machine was like standing before a tidal wave. You could fight all you wanted, but the water still swept you away. Some campaigns became legendary, like Oyo's repeated expeditions against Dahomey. Dahomey, tough and ambitious in its own right, resisted fiercely, but Oyo's superior cavalry power often forced them into tribute-paying positions. Year after year, Dahomey delivered goods and captives as the price of survival. It wasn't a permanent conquest, but it showed how Oyo used its military like a hammer smashing until rivals bent into shape. Doesn't that sound like the big bully in a schoolyard, who might not sit in your classroom, but make sure you know who rules recess? The raids weren't random chaos. They were organized with frightening efficiency. Scouts moved first, mapping enemy settlements, identifying weak spots. Then came the cavalry to strike fast, cutting off escape routes. Infantry followed to mop up burn fields and seize what could be carried. It was a choreography of destruction rehearsed so many times that it became second nature. The captives gathered in these campaigns didn't just vanish into Oyo. They became the currency of empire. Through them, Oyo could trade with Hausa merchants for horses, or with coastal traders for firearms and luxury goods. War wasn't just about glory. It was about maintaining a cycle that kept the empire alive. At this point, you might ask yourself, could an empire this dependent on expansion ever stop? The answer is tricky. To keep its warriors motivated and its nobles satisfied, Oyo had to keep winning. Victories meant spoils. Spoils meant loyalty. Without expansion, cracks began to show, and loyalties wavered. It's like a business built on constant growth. If profits stall, investors pull out, and the structure begins to crumble. But during its peak, the rewards outweighed the risks. Every campaign added layers of wealth and prestige, reinforcing Oyo's reputation as the terror of the region. And while today we might compare it to modern states, depending on exports like oil or tech, Oyo's export was people and tribute drawn in through relentless campaigning. As grim as that is, it was the reality of how empires sustained themselves in the 17th and 18th centuries. Think about the soldiers themselves for a moment. To them, these raids weren't just duty, they were opportunities. A successful raid might mean new wealth slaves who could be sold, or gifts that elevated a man's status back home. The ordinary foot soldier had as much incentive to push forward as his general did. That personal stake gave the army a ferocity you could feel from a distance, and while raids filled the empire's coffers, they also fueled enemies' resentment. No one likes being raided year after year. That resentment simmered sometimes, boiling over into rebellions, which Oyo then crushed with even harsher campaigns. It was a cycle of dominance, rebellion, suppression, and tributes spinning endlessly until the machine itself began to wear down. Still standing on the dusty road watching prisoners, tied in long lines, soldiers cheering their victory, and traders already bargaining for captives, you can't deny the sheer scale of Oyo's enterprise. Expansion wasn't a side project, it was the very backbone of military power. And the spoils weren't just measured in people or cattle. They also funded the very tools of war spears, bows, charms, and eventually firearms that shaped the next level of Oyo's battlefield mastery. You crouch in the dust at the edge of a battlefield, squinting as the sun bounces off metal tips and leather shields. The noise is a storm, drums war, cries the stamping of horses, and in the middle of it all, you see the real machinery of Oyo's warfare weapons, armor, and tactics tested again and again across generations. Forget the image of armies rushing blindly at each other. Oyo fought with precision, and its arsenal was both practical and symbolic. Start with the basics: spears, bows, and arrows. The spear was the most versatile, doubling as a thrusting weapon in close quarters and a projectile when distance mattered. Spears in Oyo weren't crude sticks, but carefully crafted tools tipped with iron forged by Yoruba blacksmiths who were masters of their craft. Bows and arrows, on the other hand, added reach, softening enemies before the cavalry swept in. Arrows could be tipped with iron or even smeared with herbal concoctions, half medicine, half menace. You can imagine how terrifying it must have been to see volleys of arrows blotting the sky, knowing even a small cut might carry something more than pain. Then there were the shields. Broad, leather-covered frames that gleamed in the sun, carried not just for defense, but for identity. Warriors painted or decorated them, turning each shield into a badge of belonging. On the battlefield, a row of shields raised in unison was like a wall of defiance, and breaking through it wasn't as easy as you might think. Add to this charms and amulets tucked into belts or tied around arms, spiritual armor meant to deflect danger, or at least give courage to believe it would. After all, isn't half of war fought in the mind before the first blow is struck? And then you notice the armor. Not plate and chain like medieval Europe, but quilted cotton, thickened with layers, and sometimes treated to harden. This kind of armor was surprisingly effective against arrows and light blades, and it had the advantage of being breathable in the West African climate. Cavalrymen often wore extra protection leather caps, breastplates, and sometimes horse armor too. Picture it, a mounted warrior gleaming with layered cotton talismans, dangling spear poised, half soldier, half spectacle. Would you stand your ground against that? Or would your legs carry you elsewhere before your brain had even decided? But weapons are only as good as the tactics behind them. Oyo generals knew how to choreograph a battle. Cavalry often delivered the first shock, charging in to scatter the enemy's front line. Infantry pressed forward in organized blocks, shields overlapping spears, bristling like a porcupine's quills. Archers and slingers worked the edges, peppering opponents with missiles. The effect was overwhelming, a mix of speed force and psychological dread. If the enemy stood, they risked being crushed. If they ran, the cavalry hunted them down. It's the military equivalent of being cornered in a chess game. Every move leads to checkmate. One of the cleverest tactics Oyo used was ambush. Scouts would lure enemies into valleys or forests, only for hidden units to spring out at the perfect moment. In a time before satellite images or drones, the knowledge of terrain was a weapon all its own, and Oyo commanders wielded it ruthlessly. Doesn't that sound like modern sports teams studying every angle of a stadium before the big match preparation can turn home turf into a trap? Weapons also carried ritual weight. Before battles, warriors often underwent ceremonies to charge their gear with spiritual power. Blacksmiths weren't just craftsmen. They were seen as men who worked with fire and iron, bridging the human and divine. A spear from their forge wasn't just metal, it was destiny in your hand. And when warriors sang chants about charms protecting them, you could feel the fusion of faith and iron turning into courage. Now think about the sheer logistics. Armies this large didn't just carry weapons out of thin air. Blacksmiths labored constantly to forge spearheads and arrow tips. Leather workers stitched armor, and traders moved iron from one region to another. In a sense, the entire empire was a factory feeding its battlefield machine. When you look at it that way, every farmer, craftsman, and trader was part of Oyo's military power, even if they never set foot in a fight. On the field, these tools and tactics turned into something larger than life. Rows of warriors chanting in rhythm shields, flashing arrows streaking through the sky. It wasn't just a battle, it was theater. The stage was set, the audience was terrified enemies, and the performance was designed to end with Oyo standing tall. And what makes theater work sound? Because as mighty as the weapons were, battles were glued together by rhythm and signal, by drums and horns that told warriors when to strike, when to advance, and when to scare the living daylights out of their foes. If you had to choose between facing a charging horse or a drum that convinces your legs to run before the horse even arrives, which one do you fear more? You'd be surprised how often sound wins. On Oyo's battlefields, noise isn't just background. It's a weapon sharpened by rhythm, tuned in tonal language, and fired across miles with eerie precision. You stand on a ridge and hear it building, the Dundun talking drum, tightening under a skilled hand, the bata answering like thunder under a roof, ivory horns lifting a long, cold note that makes brave men feel their breakfast climbing back up. After the crack of spear on shield, after the glint of arrowheads, we talked about this is the part that gets into your head before steel ever meets skin. The Yoruba talking drum can imitate speech, yes, actually speak, by mirroring the tones of the language. A master drummer doesn't just keep time, he delivers sentences. So on campaign messages ripple from unit to unit, like texts sent without a phone bill. A phrase for advance curves upward, a phrase for flank left dips and curls, and a stark clipped pattern can mean hold until the horsemen strike. If you've ever relied on GPS's calm voice to get you through a maze of city streets, imagine replacing it with a drum that can say, in rhythm, don't turn there. Ambush. Neat right, also terrifying if you're on the receiving end, and you realize your enemy can brief an entire army without a single flag raised. You watch the lead drummer, often an officer in his own right, lift the hourglass-shaped gangan, wedge it under his arm, and squeeze to tighten the skin mid-beat. The pitch rises as if the drum itself is inhaling tension. Behind him, the bata crew lays the floor thick, steady, a sound like rain on packed earth. Signalers with horns, akorin, and kakaki in some accounts through northern influence blast cues that cut through wind and panic. The mix works like layers in a film score. One carries the message, one carries the mood, one slices through chaos, so even riders half a mile away know it's time to move. Remember how the cavalry in Section 1 felt like a trailer before the movie? The drums are the jump scare the trailer promised. Psychology sits front row. A steady, unbroken rhythm says we're not tired. A sudden silence says, we just vanished into the bush. Good luck guessing where. A frantic roll says now. The enemy learns to read these signals, which is exactly why Oyo's drummers love to lie. They fake a retreat with fading beats, then explode into clattering crescendos as cavalry sweeps from a hidden angle. Chess with percussion, your move, if your nerves still obey you. Have you ever been in a stadium where the home crowd's chant makes you forget your own team's game plan? But with consequences your coach can't fix on Monday. Songs matter too. War chants catalog victories. Praise the Alafin tease rivals by name. Yes, actual name taunts, and perhaps most importantly, stitch courage into the ribcage. You hear a verse, the Esso love-tight phrases, quick breath, the kind that makes feet step forward without asking the brain's permission. And because belief is half the battle, charms are activated by the right chorus. Is the amulet stronger because the song says so? Or is the warrior stronger because he believes the song from 30 paces? The effect looks identical, a man who will not break. Communication isn't only horizontal across the line. It's vertical, from the Alafin's intent to the soldier's hand. Drums are the ladder. Orders frame the opening pattern. Sub-commanders translate that motif into local variations. A roll here for a ravine, a pause there for a hedge of thorns, a long horn for the cavalry gate. We described back in section 4. Narrow-angled, perfect for trapping someone who thought speed alone could save them. When people say Oyo was well organized, this is what they mean: a battlefield where information moves faster than fear. Night operations turn sound into a lantern. In darkness, the smallest beat can betray a unit, but silence can betray morale. Oyo plays that line like a violin. Scout signal with soft strokes on Kalangu variants, almost a whisper on leather, then a single horn pulse to mark distance. If you're on watch for the other side and you hear 3 soft beats and a horn that seems closer than it should be, your stomach does that slow elevator drop. You grasp at your spear not because someone is charging, but because your mind just sprinted 3 miles and left your legs behind. There's theater here, absolutely, and Oyo stages it on purpose. Standard bearers sway banners just enough for moonlight to catch. Maskers from traditions related to a gungun sometimes accompany marches in home territory to bless the road, a moving reminder that ancestors approve the mission. No gore, nothing grotesque, just pageantry with edge. The idea is that you're outnumbered not only by living fighters, but by the weight of memory itself. How many opponents want to argue with a parade that looks like history waking up? Then comes misdirection. A decoy drum group hammers the cadence of an advance on one ridgeline, while the real strike force circles low where grasses bend. Runners carry short, memorized phrases to bridge gaps. The drums can't cover redundancy before modern radios invented the word. If noise reveals position, Oyo makes false noise. If quiet suggests weakness, Oyo turns quiet into a spring. You start to appreciate why seasoned enemies sometimes refused open battle and hid behind palisades, only to learn, as we've seen, that gates and angles favor the patient drummer too. Not every sound is musical. Blacksmith hammers near the rear, punctuate the day with a practical beat repairs, rivets the little noises that say, we can keep this going. The cook fires crackle, leather creaks, horses snort. A good commander hears in those ordinary sounds the health of the army. If the fires are too quiet, men are hungry. If leather stops creaking, tack is drying and will fail. Drums get the headlines, but logistics hums the bass line you only miss when it drops out. And yes, sometimes Oyo borrows tech from trade. Imported long horns with piercing, almost metallic timbre ride in from northern contacts. European muskets appear by the coast and eventually join the score with their own thunderclap punctuation. A single volley crashes like a fallen tree in a silent forest, not yet decisive in these centuries, but useful for timing. Startle here, charge there, let the echo do half the work. You remember the stadium chant again and realize the loudest team isn't always the best. But the best team always knows when to be loud. If you've ever calmed yourself with a playlist before a big presentation, you already understand. Oyo's secret rhythm organizes fear. Drums convert scattered hearts into one pulse turn, scattered feet into one stride, and teach a whole army to breathe in the same small window before impact. The cavalry's hooves may shake the ground, but the drummer's hand decides when the earth should tremble. And when the noise stops on purpose, that hush is not relief. It's a held breath, funded, fed, and kept possible by the deeper machine of wealth and trade that buys the time, the horses, the iron, and the very skins that speak. You wake to the clatter of hooves in the garrison yard, and the first thing you notice isn't the warriors, but the merchants. For every spear lifted and every drum beaten, there's a sack of grain, hauled a string of horses, led a caravan trudging in from the north. Oyo's military didn't run on courage alone. It ran on trade and wealth, the invisible oil in the gears of war. Without it, those dramatic cavalry charges and ESO oaths we've walked through would have sputtered out like a fire without kindling. Take the horses, for instance. They didn't sprout from Oyo's soil. They came from farther north across savanna routes that linked the empire to Hausa and Nupe traders. Each horse had a backstory, bought in Kano, driven south through Nupe lands, swapped for cowries captives or cloth, and finally stabled in Oyo's capital. Owning hundreds of these animals meant that Oyo wasn't just fighting wars. It was sustaining a constant flow of commerce. Imagine running a modern delivery service, where every truck has to be imported, fed special fuel, and kept alive in a climate that doesn't suit it. That's logistics 17th century style. Then there were firearms. Early on, Oyo's warriors fought mostly with spears, bows, and cotton armor, but the lure of European guns arriving on the coast through trade with Portuguese, Dutch, and later English merchants was too strong to ignore. These weren't always cutting-edge muskets, often second-hand, often prone to misfires, but in the right hands, they added thunder to Oyo's arsenal. And here's the important part. Guns weren't simply bought with coin. They were bought with people the captives seized in raids we traced in Section 5. This grim exchange plugged Oyo into the wider Atlantic system, tying faraway ships to the dust of Yoruba roads. Wealth also flowed through tribute. Vassal states beaten into submission sent annual gifts, cowries, cloth slaves, livestock. Tribute wasn't just revenue, it was proof of dominance. Picture a defeated king kneeling to hand over horses or bags of shells. The items mattered, but the act itself was the true prize, the admission that Oyo's might had forced his hand. Tribute then fed the machine horses to cavalry shells, to trade cloth, to pay retainers, and the cycle spun on. It's a bit like modern superpowers demanding not just taxes, but symbolic shows of loyalty, like flying the right flag or signing the right treaty. Oyo's location turned it into a crossroads. Caravans brought salt leather and metal from the north. Coastal routes offered gunslicker and European goods from the south. The empire sat like a spider in the middle of a web, tugging threads and growing fat on the vibrations. Every market day in Oyo Ile buzzed with proof that war and wealth were twins. Soldiers rubbed shoulders with merchants. Eso swaggered past stalls, piled with cola nuts and fabrics, and horse traders haggled with officials who knew every negotiation was really about the next campaign. The Agile system, imperial agents, posted in vassal towns, made sure the flow never stopped. They collected tribute, enforced loyalty, and channeled resources back to the capital. Of course, they were hated, often seen as greedy and oppressive, but their job kept the empire's arteries unclogged. And arteries matter. You can have the strongest arms in the world, but if the blood flow stops, the body collapses. Oyo knew this, which is why controlling trade routes was as important as winning battles. Consider the cowrie shell, tiny and fragile, yet the backbone of Oyo's economy, imported in vast quantities from the Indian Ocean through coastal trade. Cowries became currency. Soldiers could be paid in them, horses bought with them, markets measured by them. Imagine basing your paycheck on seashells, and you start to see both the genius and fragility of the system. Without constant inflows of cowries, the empire risked inflation or shortages, which meant keeping trade routes open wasn't just smart, it was survival. Even religion and wealth braided together in sustaining the military. Before campaigns, offerings had to be made, sacrifices of animals, distributions of goods to priests to secure divine favor. Those goods came from the empire's coffers, which meant success in war was always tied back to financial reserves. You can almost hear the priests muttering, "No tribute, no blessing. No blessing, no victory." It's a loop, and like any loop, breaking one link threatened the whole. Wealth also shaped ambition. As spoils grew, so did appetites. Chiefs and generals demanded larger shares. Eso expected richer rewards, and provincial governors fattened their households. For decades, the machine could keep up. But you might guess what happens when trade stumbles or tribute dries up. Resentment festers, loyalty frays, and the same wealth that once glued the empire together becomes the crack that splits it. For now, though, you stroll through Oyo's great market, dazzled by colors, smells, and sounds. Horses stamp in their pens, muskets gleam under awnings, cowries clink in bags, and Eso warriors strut with new charms bought from passing traders. Everything feels secure, humming, unstoppable. But behind the bustle lies a question. What happens when rivals get tired of feeding this machine, or when vassals realize they too can play the game of rebellion? You leave the bustling market behind, and suddenly the mood shifts. The smell of roasted grain and horse sweat gives way to whispers of rebellion, rumors of rivals plotting just beyond the horizon. For centuries, Oyo's cavalry and Eso warriors had marched wherever the Alafin and council willed, fueled by tribute and trade. But nothing lasts forever. You can almost feel it in the air, the slow unraveling, like a drum skin stretched too tight, beginning to crack at the edges. Rival kingdoms never forgot their defeats. Dahomey, once forced into paying tribute, simmered with resentment and waited for chances to resist. Farther north, Nupi and Hausa states eyed Oyo's horses and wealth with envy. Every time the empire flexed, it created grudges. Every grudge was a seed waiting for the right season. And when wealth wobbled or leadership stumbled, those seeds sprouted quickly. If you've ever seen weeds push through cracks in pavement, you'll know how relentless suppressed rivals can be once the pressure lifts. But rebellion wasn't just external, it festered within. The Agel system, those imperial agents who collected tribute in conquered towns, became hated symbols of Oyo's overreach. Vassal states resented the constant drain of people and goods. At first, fear kept them quiet, but as cracks widened, boldness grew. A province that once trembled at cavalry hoofbeats began to whisper, "Why keep feeding the empire when it can no longer protect us?" It's the same question citizens ask of any failing government in any era. What's the point if the contract is broken? And then came Afanja, the Kakanfo of Ilorin, the empire's great field commander, whose ambition twisted into rebellion. Appointed as Oyo's supreme military leader in the northern frontier, Afanja turned his power base into a weapon not for the Alafin, but against him. Imagine the shock the very office meant to project Oyo's power became the pivot of its downfall. Afanja's alliances with Fulani groups in Ilorin created a fracture that would never heal. It was like giving your best general control of the army, only to watch him decide he'd rather build his own kingdom. This rebellion didn't erupt in a vacuum. It fed on the empire's overextension. Oyo had pushed too far, demanded too much, and when trade routes faltered or tribute slowed, soldiers grew restless. Eso warriors might keep their code, but ordinary troops asked themselves what spoils were left. A hungry army is dangerous not just to enemies, but to its own masters. You can almost hear the grumbling around campfires. Why march again if the only ones getting rich are chiefs and agents? Meanwhile, the Oyo Mesi and the Alafin bickered. The very balance of power that once kept the empire stable began to paralyze it. Councils quarreled, kings lost legitimacy, and enemies outside smelled weakness. Dahomey tested the leash again. Ilorin slipped free, and soon the once unbeatable cavalry faced opponents just as organized, just as ruthless. What happens when your enemies learn your playbook? They copy your tactics. They buy the same guns. They train to counter your horses. Suddenly, the weapon that made you invincible starts to look ordinary. It's almost tragic, isn't it? The same drum beats that once carried perfect signals now echoed over confused ranks. The same fortified gates that once symbolized permanence now trapped rulers inside cities as allies melted away. You picture an Alafin staring at an empty calabash delivered by his council, realizing his own chiefs had lost faith. Power slipped not in a single dramatic collapse, but in slow erosion, like a wall crumbling grain by grain, until one day it falls with a sigh. Do you ever notice how empires often dig their own graves by pushing too far? Rome did it, the Ottomans did it, and Oyo, for all its brilliance, walked the same road. Expansion bred dependency, dependency bred overreach, and overreach cracked the empire open for rivals and rebels to feast on. From the vantage of hindsight, it seems inevitable. But to those living through it, the shock must have felt like waking from a dream where you thought you were invincible. And yet, even in decline, Oyo didn't vanish into silence. Its legacy of cavalry, Eso honor council politics, and fortified towns left imprints all across Yoruba land. Later Yoruba states, even in the shadow of Ilorin, and colonial powers carried pieces of Oyo's memory. The empire might stumble, but its rhythm never quite died. And as you drift toward the final stretch of this journey, you realize decline isn't the end of the story. What matters just as much is the legacy, what echoes remained, what lessons survived, and how the very memory of Oyo's military might still shapes how people imagine power in West Africa. If an empire falls in the forest of history, but its drumbeats are still heard centuries later, did it ever really disappear? You stand in the dust of Oyo Ile, the abandoned capital where weeds push through the cracks of once busy courtyards. The walls we marveled at are broken, the garrison silent, the horse yards empty. And yet, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes, the thrum of hooves, the roll of drums, the chant of Iso warriors daring death to blink first. Collapse was real, but memory refused to die. The empire unraveled in the 19th century, undone by Afanja's rebellion in Ilorin-Fulani expansion and the grinding weight of internal division. What cavalry couldn't outrun politics consumed. The Alafin, once feared as a king, who commanded armies across Yorubaland, became a shadow, boxed in by rivals and undermined by his own chiefs. But even as the throne dimmed, the stories grew brighter. Parents told children of the days when Oyo's horses shook the earth, when Eso warriors made enemies tremble, when tribute flowed like rivers into the capital. Memory itself became a weapon, sharpening Yoruba pride long after the empire's banners fell. Think of it like Rome. The Western Empire collapsed, but who stopped talking about Roman law? Roman legions, Roman roads. Oyo worked the same way. Its cavalry tactics influenced neighbors. Its council system shaped Yoruba politics, and its legacy of honor codes still lingers in sayings and ceremonies. Even Ilorin the breakaway that helped topple Oyo carried pieces of its military DNA forward. Decline didn't erase the blueprint, it just spread it. The collapse also carried lessons. Wealth built on constant raids proved unsustainable. Vassals eventually revolted rather than keep feeding the machine. Horses that once seemed unstoppable became vulnerable when enemies adopted guns more effectively. Councils that balanced kingship began to paralyze it when unity was most needed. Each of these cracks tells a story you can still recognize in today's world empires that overextend governments, that suffocate under their own politics. Superpowers that learned too late their rivals studied every move. Doesn't that feel uncomfortably familiar when you watch the news? Yet alongside the warnings, there's admiration. The logistical genius of importing horses across savannas, the discipline of Iso warriors, the sophistication of using drums as battlefield radios. These weren't accidents. They were innovations born of necessity turned into traditions that still inspire awe. Even today, Yoruba festivals feature the talking drum as a centerpiece, its voice echoing the same tonal commands once used in war. The heritage of rhythm as power remains alive not in battlefields, but in music halls and community gatherings. The ruins of Oyo-Il now sit quietly visited by historians, tourists, and descendants who trace pride through stones and earthworks. Standing there, you realize the empire's story isn't about defeat alone. It's about resilience, about the way memory stretches further than walls. A horse may fall, a drum may break, a palace may crumble, but the tale keeps riding, beating, chanting. Oyo's name still carries weight because memory refuses to bury it. And that's the thing, military power isn't only measured in battles won. It's measured in the legacies it leaves behind. The Oyo Empire's legacies ripple through Yoruba identity, in political thought, in cultural pride, and in the echoes of drums that once terrified enemies and now delight audiences. Collapse ended the campaigns, but it didn't end the idea. The idea that organization, honor, rhythm, and trade could make a people mighty still resonates. So when you close your eyes tonight, hear those hooves one last time rolling over the plains. Picture the Iso warriors chanting their spears, lifted like lightning rods. Picture the Alafin weighing counsel, the Oyo Mesi murmuring the drums, signaling across fields. Then picture silence broken, not by fear, but by memory, the kind of silence that still carries stories through centuries. And ask yourself, is power really gone? when its rhythm still makes your heart beat faster. Close your eyes and let the plains grow quiet. You've walked the roads of Oyo, heard hooves, felt drums met Iso honor, and watched councils steer war and peace. Horses' walls, trade, and courage built a power that rose, faltered, and became memory. Now, the dust settles soft as linen. Fires dim to embers. Banners fold into the night. What remains is a gentle rhythm order craft and story breathing like a drum at rest. Let that rhythm guide your breath slow. And even as the empire drifts beyond the horizon, and you drift too safe warm, carried by history into sleep,